I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right. But we've got to be very careful here. The question here is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? I'm not claiming that we must. Nor is the question, can we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? I certainly think that we can. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values and duties exist? And like Mackey and Roos, I honestly don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, human morality is objective. After all, given a naturalistic view, what's so special about human beings? They're just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On the naturalistic view, some actions, say rape, may not be socially advantageous. And so in the course of human development, it's become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is wrong. Such behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. On the naturalistic view, there's nothing really wrong with raping someone. And thus, without God, there is no absolute right and wrong which imposes itself on our conscience. But the problem is, premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of objective moral values and duties which impose themselves upon us. There's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world. The reasoning of Michael Roos at best proves that our subjective perception of moral values has evolved. But if moral values are gradually discovered rather than invented, then our gradual and fallible perception of the moral realm no more undermines the objectivity of that realm than our gradual and fallible perception of the physical world undermines the objectivity of that realm. Most of us recognize, I think, that in moral experience we do apprehend objective moral values and duties. Roos himself confesses in another context, and I quote, "The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, tolerance, self-sacrifice are really good. But if objective values and duties cannot exist without God, and objective moral values and duties do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that 3, therefore, God exists. And thus I think we have good moral grounds for affirming the existence of God. Number 5, the possibility of God's existence. I've rarely shared this argument in a public lecture, not because I think it's unsound, but because it's so abstract that students are apt to either think it's a trick or not to understand it. But I'm going to go out on a limb and share it with you this afternoon. Now, in order to understand this argument, you need to understand what philosophers mean by possible worlds. A possible world is just a way the world might have been. It's a complete description of reality. So, a possible world is not a planet or a universe or any kind of concrete object. It's just a world description. The actual world is the description that is true. Other possible worlds are descriptions that are not in fact true, but which might have been true. To say that something exists in some possible world is to say that there is some possible description of reality which includes that entity in the description. To say that something exists in every possible world means that no matter which description is true, the entity will be included in the description. For example, unicorns do not in fact exist, but there is some possible world in which unicorns exist. On the other hand, many mathematicians think that mathematical objects like numbers exist in every possible world. Now, with that in mind, consider the ontological argument, which was discovered in the year 1011 by the monk Anselm of Canterbury. God, Anselm observes, is by definition the greatest being conceivable. If you could conceive of anything greater than God, then that would be God. So the very concept of God is of the greatest conceivable being, a maximally great being. So what would such a being be like? Well, he would be all-powerful, all-knowing, all good, and he would exist in every logically possible world. A being which lacked any of those properties would not be maximally great. We could conceive of something greater. But what that implies is that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows that God must exist. For if a maximally great being exists in any possible world, he exists in all of them. That's part of what it means to be maximally great, to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good in every logically possible world. So if God's existence is even possible, then he exists in every logically possible world, and therefore in the actual world. We can summarize this argument as follows. Premise 1, it's possible that a maximally great being, aka God, exists. 2, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5, therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. 6, therefore, a maximally great being exists. 7, therefore, God exists. Now, it might surprise you to learn that steps 2 to 7 of this argument are relatively uncontroversial. Most philosophers by far would agree that if God's existence is even possible, then he must exist. So the whole question is premise 1. Is God's existence possible? Well, what do you think? The atheist has to maintain that it's impossible that God exists. He has to say that the concept of God is incoherent, like the concept of a married bachelor or a square circle. But the problem is that the concept of God just doesn't seem to be incoherent in that way. The idea of a being which is all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing in every logically possible world seems to be perfectly coherent. Moreover, as we've already seen, there are other arguments for God's existence which at least suggest that it's possible that God exists. So I'll simply leave it with you this afternoon. Do you think, as I do, that it's possible that God exists? If so, then it follows logically that he does exist. Number 6, the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was by all accounts a remarkable individual. New Testament historians have reached something of a consensus that the historical Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, with the claim to stand and speak in the place of God himself. That's why the Jewish leadership instigated his crucifixion on the charge of blasphemy. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come. And as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of exorcisms and miracle working. But certainly the supreme confirmation of his claim was his alleged resurrection from the dead. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then it would seem that we have a divine miracle on our hands, and thus evidence for the existence of God. Now, most people would probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in, by faith or not. But in fact, there are actually three established facts which are recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus: the empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of his disciples' belief in his resurrection. Let me say just a very brief word about each of these. Fact number one: Jesus' tomb was in fact discovered empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after the crucifixion. According to Jakob Kramer, who is an Austrian specialist in this area, and I quote, "By far most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. According to D.H. Van Dalen, it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it," he says, "do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions." Fact number two: on separate occasions, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to Gert Ludemann, a prominent German New Testament critic, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. These appearances were witnessed not only by believers, but also by skeptics, unbelievers, and even enemies of the early Christian movement. Fact number three: the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus despite every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation that the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number one, their leader was dead. And Jewish messianic expectations included no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. Secondly, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. Luke Johnson, who is a New Testament scholar at Emory University, states some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. And N.T. Wright, who is an eminent British scholar, concludes, "That is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him." Attempts to explain away these three great facts, like the disciples stole the body or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these facts. And therefore, it seems to me the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be. But that entails that God exists. And we can summarize this argument as follows. Number one, there are three established facts concerning Jesus of Nazareth: the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Two, the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead is the best explanation of these facts. Three, the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead entails that the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists. Therefore, the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists.